In the name of our group of the Quality of Democracy and also Delibera Brasil and Rede de Conhecimento Social, we will start our seminar this afternoon. And I will make short presentations of our speaker and discussants, and then I'll ask to Silvia Cervellini from Delibera Brasil come just to tell us a brief note about how we get here this afternoon. And then we'll listen. Ian talk to us about his experience for 30 minutes, and then the discussants will talk to us about this experience, right? So we are pleased to receive here with us Ian Walker, Executive Director of New Democracy Foundation in Australia, where he is since 2011, right? And he have been leading more than 20 pilot projects in local and regional and national governments. So he will talk a little about his work there. And as discussants, I'd like to invite to join us already, or if you want to come after his speak, you can decide. You can join us if you want. So José Álvaro Moisés is a full professor of the Department of Political Science and senior researcher at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of São Paulo. So professor, if you want to join us. And Sérgio Fausto, who is political scientist and superintendent of the Fundação of the Institute Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So I'd like to ask you to join us, and we will listen to Silvia just a few words to tell us how we get here this afternoon. Silvia is the coordinator of our collective called Delibera Brasil. So Silvia, please.
Well, in fact, I would like to make a very strong thankful. We are very, very thankful for being here and to have this opportunity. I want to thank Professor Moisés, who has made this possible, accepting our invitation, and Sérgio Fausto, who is going to be with us. He accepted. I'm really grateful because he has another event at Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso at 5 p.m., so he will have to leave at maximum 4 p.m. So thank you so much for being here with us. And Ian, of course, for coming from Fortaleza, where we were starting a project, and he accepted to come here before doing a little trip back to Australia. So thank you so much for doing this. And José Veríssimo, who is a dear colleague in Delibera Brasil and was the person who made this possible too. So thanks so much, and the other colleagues. So we are here because we have started this collective Delibera Brasil to bring this, the democratic innovations to Brazil, the mini publics. And Ian was of the most inspirational members of an international network called Democracy R&D, that Delibera Brasil is also a member, proudly. And so that's why we think that we wouldn't miss this opportunity to have Ian sharing with us his experiences and his learnings from this all over the world where he has been doing this. So thank you so much for everybody. And I know that we are going to enjoy and learn with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. So let's start to listen to Ian.
Firstly, thank you for listening to me in English. I'd be very long if I had to try to read in Portuguese, so I appreciate that. Australians tend to speak quite quickly, so at any point that I become too fast, this hand gesture lets me know. So it's okay if I go to America, Americans cannot understand our accent. We are told it is quite pronounced, so I take feedback. On the talk for today, I really want to start with exploring what problem do we need to solve? Because if we don't agree the problem, then the solutions will look very different. I want to share how we've approached it in Australia and our work with the UN Democracy Fund, which will start to bring some of that to Brazil. Really what I want to focus on is 5 principles that we think are really core democratic principles. They come from our Australian perspective. So hopefully there's a really good conversation. Some you will embrace, but I'm very happy for you to challenge as well. So hopefully that's a good use of around about half an hour as we step through what problem are we solving, how have we gone about it, and the principles that underpin deliberation. Let's see if I can click the right way. I can. I want to give you a little introduction as to who we are as an organisation. We are a private foundation funded by a former political donor. So like most countries, Australians believe their democracy is in the worst shape of anywhere in the world. We are much like the British parliamentary system, where the parties elect a leader and the parties can get rid of a leader. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Marie Kondo approach. There's a Japanese lady who does house cleaning. And when you don't like something, you throw it out. It is said in Australia that we have the Marie Kondo approach to prime ministers. They stop sparking joy, we get rid of them. We have had 6 prime ministers in 6 years. We've been doing this for 10 years. And what we thought is, who would you trust as an entity to change democracy? The first thing is, you can't take positions on any issues. If you think there's an answer to a problem, well then you can't be the one to design the process, because people will think you're just trying to deliver the one answer. So we will never comment on any issue, no matter how obvious. Secondly, do you know the main objection to someone working in democratic reform? They say, if you want to change something, get elected. So we, from the start, included former politicians from the left and the right behind us. They don't agree on a lot of things, but they agree that our democracy needs innovation. We take a system from over 130 years ago and we keep using it. Everything else in society changes with the times. Why not the rules of our democracy? So hopefully that gives you a really little sense of who we are. Our approach is simply show, don't tell. We can write all the theory we want about democratic change. What matters is the projects you run. For local government, for a state government, for a national government, just run it and see if it works. There is a lot of theory that doesn't always work in practice. That's a really good thing to discover. So, what is the problem? It's really interesting to see how people approach this question. I get approached by a lot of people who say, the problem is we have such bad politicians. They are stupid, they are corrupt. And we disagree. If I had to run for election for my job every 3 years, I would do different things as well. I would try to be popular because my future depends on it. That's what we mean by systemic incentives. Maybe elections aren't a great way to build trust. Why do we have democracy? Our view is we have democracy because we've all got to get along. It's social cohesion. There are some decisions that are just going to affect us all. So if your goal is that we all get along, why would you run an election campaign to do that? Because an election campaign is built on saying, this is the worst person ever. He's so bad that you should ignore me. We often use the analogy, imagine if airlines... Of course. You get picked on if you sit next to me, so Joe, that's the way it is. Imagine if airlines advertised like political parties run campaigns. Now I know Azul, what's another airline here? LATAM. Imagine the next ad on television for LATAM says, if you fly Azul, you will be a burning wreck into the sea and everybody will perish. It's not a reason to fly with the other airline. It's a reason to think that all airline travel is bad. Our political parties have been attacking each other with so much venom that we've started to believe them all. That's the challenge that we seek to face. There are systemic incentives to attack the other, end up taking everybody down. The top one is why I put it in green. What's our ultimate goal in a decision? There's no right answer to most public policy issues. There are many different ways to fund a health system or an education system. The government can pay, or citizens can pay through savings accounts. It doesn't matter. What matters is the mass of the community looks out and says, that seems fair. They don't think it was influenced by major interests. So we work back from, what am I trying to deliver? I'm not trying to deliver the right decision. We're trying to deliver a trusted decision. And that trusted decision will change by whatever place you're in, and that's okay. We've done projects around city budgeting, and often, the cities have spent far more than they should. The left of politics would suggest you should raise taxes. The right of politics would suggest you cut services and sell assets. There isn't a right answer. When we ask citizens to solve it, it tends not to look like what either the left of politics or the right of politics would do, because they're not thinking about the election, they're just solving the problem in front of them. And each city will be different in maybe what they should be doing differently. We often use the nickname, there is something for everybody to hate, because it won't fit neatly in one side of politics. So that's trust and systemic incentives. The third problem is bubbles. Social media means we all hang out with people who are just like us. Makes it very hard to think of the people who are different to us or hold different views. One of the best things about the jury methodology is a random sample of people has people from all walks of life, very different backgrounds, that are simply asked to solve a problem together. And the together matters. We do not know how to do this in a digital environment. We have not been able to replicate what works in person. We have tried, I think we're up to 14 different approaches using technology. 14 failures. We cannot think of a solution to this problem. But the absolute core of what I hope you go home with today, and when I say what is wrong with Australian democracy, and I would suggest a few other countries as well, is that the system really gives a lot of priority to public opinion. What you think in the next 5 seconds, rather than considering public judgment. Now, I want you to think, we have the jury system, as I believe you also do. I'm going to pick on you again. We go out, we have a fabulous night. You can come as well. And we get arrested. Very serious crime. We will not immediately say, I demand a phone poll of 1,000 people to determine if we go to jail. Why? The phone poll of people will just look at our pictures and make a quick judgment, and I will come off badly on that. What do we want people to do instead? We want people to consider evidence. We want them to slow down into the decision. We want them to work out which of the sources they can trust and which seems a little unreliable. And we want them to work until most of them can find agreement. And that's the difference between public opinion and public judgment. Now, elections really reward public opinion. You're effectively trying to poke someone until they realise that they don't like the other person more. We use a nickname. Elections are an exercise in trying to work out who you hate less. And that's not the fault of the people running for office. That's the system, that's the rules, so they work within the rules. Now, many people in Australia would say, politicians should stop listening to public opinion. But they can't. If you have an election coming up, you'll lose your job if you're not listening to public opinion. So instead of saying ignore public opinion, can we build something better, which is public judgment? So, as I mentioned, we're an Australian organisation, and I'll talk a little bit about the project we have with the UN Democracy Fund. If you want to take a look and think, oh, where do I see one of these projects that has been done fantastically? The best organisations who do this are based in Ireland. They've taken on very, very difficult problems. Ireland, through the global financial crisis in 2007, their economy, their tax receipts halved. They also had a series of scandals which caused people to lose confidence in the church, which was a very trusted institution in Ireland. So it was a very, very difficult situation. they ran a constitutional convention where 66 randomly selected people, just a rough match to who the community is, were blended with 33 politicians from different sides and said, what should we do about the Irish Constitution? How can it better represent us? What was brilliant about that exercise is that it builds trust in two directions. Sure, citizens don't trust politicians. But if you spend 50, 60, 70 hours with them, you get a little bit of subtlety into your views. You start to understand maybe you're not such a bad person in person, it's just when you go on television that you have to be fiery and shouty. Equally, the politicians started to see that citizens were not just people who yelled at them, they were people who had something to contribute. They were people who were capable and could read and could learn and could solve problems. Politicians can often think we are the professionals, leave it to me. And all of a sudden they saw there was value in having citizens who would stand alongside them. So if you take one example out from today and think I need to take a look at Ireland. Yes, we're fortunate in Australia. I think we're up to about 28 projects now which we've led. 2 of them have gone quite badly, and it's good to embrace the things that go wrong, because when you share that, the next person learns from it. This is still a developing area. But when it works unbelievably well. Now, when I say works, it doesn't mean they gave a technically perfect answer. It means that we took a group of 40 or 50 people, really different people, really different perspectives, and they were able to find agreement. They were able to tell government the reasoning and rationale behind what they said. They gave an informed judgment, not just a snap opinion. What do one of these projects look like? You as a citizen get a lovely invitation in some form. In Australia, they look like you're going to go to the royal wedding. It's silver, it's polished, you feel very special. And it says the problem you're being asked to solve, and it says what the government will do with the decision. It also tells you you'll get paid, which helps as well. After we've done a random selection, and I'll have people of all different age groups, 50-50 male and female, and enough that we start to see people in blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs, different backgrounds. They come and meet in a room. They'll have read something about the issue. Now, what they're going to do is meet for one full day, about every 3 weeks, 5, 6, 7 meetings. So it's quite slow. What's the starting point? Well, you get one perspective from the government. You get some additional perspectives from other interests in an issue. The best thing you can do in a public decision is not try to only present one source of truth. It's about considering many perspectives. On an energy topic, you're better off hearing from energy companies and manufacturers and environmental groups, from wind power people and the coal industry, than simply hearing from sources you agree with. So we're taking that time to expose people to a contested range of views. From that, and a very important element for us, is we ask citizens to make an informed decision. What do you need to know? What questions do you have? And who do you trust to tell you? We live in an era when, in Australia at least, there is growing mistrust, there is wariness of experts. So what do? Well, you have lists of people available, you declare their projects they've worked on, so transparency, and say, okay, I will let you pick the experts that you want to hear from. You can go beyond that as well. Just tell us who it is. We did an energy inquiry and asked citizens that question. And they said, well, they understood solar energy. They didn't want to hear from scientists about big hot thing in the sky makes electricity. That they understood. They wanted to understand from financiers why projects didn't stack up, and from the energy companies why they wouldn't enter into long-term contracts that would make the financiers happy. You start to see, by giving them the power, They selected different sources than were just rushing to tell the government what they thought. It's a very powerful tool, and this is what takes the time. In a project spanning 5 or 6 days, you spend about half the time broadening people, and then you ask them, what's the most important information you've heard? What can you most strongly rely on? What are you challenging or doubting? And now you're progressively bringing them to a point. And the point is always to simply answer the question. If it's a budget process and you're saying, how can we live within our means? They might want to start talking about many things. But if you're always just pointing to say, how are you answering the question? It means they only need a very light touch to stay on course. The projects really are this simple. What we do is not difficult. What we do is create an environment that wouldn't otherwise exist. Governments, in Australia at least, do not commonly say to citizens, I will give you 4 months to offer feedback. And I'll make sure that you can come in where you mix with other different people and perspectives, and we will be your servants to get information that you need to answer it. It's an easy thing to do. It's just a different way of thinking about how input should come in. I've lost my clicker. What do we not like? Referenda are a terrible way to make a decision. It feels very good. Everybody should have a say. Isn't that the fairest thing on earth, that we should all get to vote on things? But if you remember, I said the problem I want to fix is about public opinion versus public judgment. Referenda are very big opinion machines. People will not think before they vote. We often look at, because it comes up a little bit, about the Brexit decision in the UK. The UK's relationship with Europe, it spans trade and immigration and science and regulation. It is impossibly complex. And they wrote an 8-word question with yes or no. What's an alternate scenario? We think the question was, what relationship do we want to have with Europe? And they've had their first referendum, which is to be respected or you will lose trust. Maybe that question would become, our relationship with Europe has to change. What should those changes be? You start to see it goes from being a yes or no opinion question to requiring a considered answer. Democracy is not simply voting. Democracy is acting on the informed general will of the people. Voting systems are very bad at finding the informed general will because they will always play to the things that annoy us most, which prompt us to go, yes, I must vote for this person because the other person is so bad. But I've said that too many times. I'm going to jump one ahead. In that jury I described that was about 6 days, what matters? What are the principles that I encourage you to care about in making a democratic decision? Firstly, this idea of random selection. On our criminal jury, when we get arrested later, we will not simply go to the courthouse steps and say, who wants to be on the jury? Because you will get 6 members of the victim's family, hopefully 6 members of our family, and they will never agree. On any public decision, there is a bell curve of views. Who do you hear from? One end here saying, government, you've absolutely got to do it. And one end here saying, the world will end if you do what they want. Here. Instead, we want to get a real randomly representative cross-section of people. We use random selection in politics today. It's how they do opinion polls. In opinion polls, we ask people what they think when they haven't been thinking. We just don't think that's a very clever thing to do. The second element is time. Why time? Well, it links to the third principle of information. In a lot of times when you see people react online on newspapers, they will never link to a source. I think. They just react. A lot of us base our views, me included, I'm not being special, on things we've heard, on gut feeling. We want people to, I don't care what they say, but we want them to ground it in something where they can point to a little bit of evidence. Now, as a guiding rule, we want to expose people to 20 to 30 sources in a project, different points of view, because we tend to want to just listen to to points of view that we already agree with, because that's really comfortable. Now, I'm going to take a really mixed group of people. People in professional jobs, people who are gardeners and plumbers, people who are unemployed, people who are rich, people who are poor. It's a mix of people considering 20 to 25 sources and then comparing what they've learnt and what they trust. That takes time. That's the big trade-off for government in doing this. That's why we try to space the meetings out about every 3 weeks. It's why we give them 40 or 50 hours and don't do it in a single day. You can't get that many people to work together. The asset we're trying to generate, why do this if you're in political office? If I'm a politician, there's nothing better than having those 40 people standing next to me. I'm not taking power away from politicians. This is something which is complementary. What a great political asset to say, people who voted for me, people who don't vote for me, I asked them a question, they agreed on this solution, then I will trust them with that solution. It can be nicknamed leading from behind. It's a great way to say, as a political leader, I set the agenda, but I listen first and then I act. The fourth key element in any project is give people a problem. Often governments want to say, no, everything is fine. We're professionals, we have this under control, which is great, but I can't get anyone to show up for that. We had a government try to say, I hope this comes out okay. They had a budget problem and they said, how can we continue to excel in financial sustainability while being the world's most livable city? It's pointless. We asked people, how can we live within our means? If I'm a citizen, which one looks like a problem that's worth solving? The second part that matters is authority. Australians don't contribute to things because we think, the government's already made up its mind. They will just do what they want to do. Actually saying what you'll do with the decision matters immensely. And the last part links to this. I obviously can't talk to government engagement in Brazil, but Australian governments have a tendency to say, here's our draft plan. Give us some feedback. And then the final plan comes out. They're identical. It's better to ask a question than sell an answer. Now, the easiest way to think about this, our health system is becoming very expensive to run. And the government commissioned a very professional report to say, what do we do about this? We have government-provided healthcare and some private health insurance. And it came out and said the way to pay for the system, everyone's going to have to pay $7 when they go to the doctor. Not so much. It went crazy. It was called a GP tax. It was the end of the world. And in 2 days, the government promised to never do it. But the problem hadn't gone away. We still don't know how to pay for our health system. What if we'd asked a jury of citizens, how can I pay for the health system we want? It's an open question. You can pay more taxes, you can do it with insurance, you can do it with savings accounts. Maybe they would have come back and said, gee, you know what? I think we have to pay $20 to go to the doctor. Because it comes from people like us, people who are not in professional advocacy, but just citizens in all sorts of jobs, we think that will be more trusted. And that's why we say, really, that's one of the most important things you can do is ask questions and resist the urge to just have to push an answer onto people. I am not asking anyone in elected office to do something unpleasant. It's already unpleasant enough as it is. If you're in elected office, I think they accept. A lot of people don't like them. They accept that it's not a really great environment. Many politicians we speak to don't like going to Parliament. It's not fun to be yelled at all the time. Projects that involve citizens are popular. It's not something where it's a poisonous task to do. It's also something where you'll commonly say, why would a politician give up power? Sometimes you think, how much power do you have today? If you try, think of that health example, if you try to change the cost in the health system, if you want to just take the decision, fantastic, just take the decision. Our democracy is very good at resolving about 70% of public decisions. Great, keep doing that. But the last 30% has become very difficult. I think we'd like to apply it to that. The closing sentiment I'd like to live with you is, we're not offering something and saying, trust us. 20 organisations around the world, us included, we're running this for local governments, for regional governments, for national governments, and most of the time it works. It's an idea worth trying. It's an idea worth saying to someone in elected office, I'm not going to attack you. I want to encourage you to try something new which I think will work for you. I want to close on what might come next. I mentioned a project with the UN Democracy Fund. The UN Democracy Fund has traditionally championed elections, and as recently, I think, a fork in the road came when Kofi Annan, as the former head of the UN, stood up and said, the use of juries, where randomly selected citizens come together and think and find common ground, is the one great idea that's going to change and rescue our democracies. We were pretty happy to hear that. And he said it on camera, so we can keep the footage. And fortunately, that caused, I think, that was a real driver for the UN Democracy Fund to say, okay, can you tell us a little more about this? So we are releasing a handbook on how to deliver these projects. It's a handbook you can show to politicians. It's a handbook you can show to government officials. It's a handbook that you can show to practitioners who run projects. If you want to run a project yourself, it shares principles and gives you that first step to doing it yourself. It'll be available in English in about a week on the New Democracy website. All going well, it'll be in Portuguese in mid-January. So we are committed to translation. I always have my heart going very fast with deadlines, but that is the commitment, is take this, share it with people. It's something you can use and do. It's something wherever your passions are, whether they are practical in projects, whether they are political, this is a starting point. And hopefully it's messaging that connects for politicians. It's not aggressive and activist. It tries to show a little bit of empathy. I'd really encourage you to use that as a first step, and I'd really encourage you to look at what will happen in Fortaleza as the first demonstration project that we will fund here to show that Australia and Brazil, we've got some differences, so let's see how you localise it here with a team and run a project. That's what I wanted to share with you today. Hopefully you've got a little taste of what a citizens' jury style project could look like, how we can change our democracies, and hopefully why other people in elected office will give it a chance. Thank you. No one did this.
So I'll start. Let me start by thanking Sylvia for this invitation, and Anna. Sylvia and I, we go a long way back. Thank you, Moisés, also for the invitation. Thank you so much, Ian, for making the time to be here today. I will not make a long comment on your talk. What I will try to do here is just to raise some questions which might be of interest to the audience as a whole, in order to sort of warm up the discussion. Well, first of all, I very much like your approach. It's incremental. It's realistic. It's ambitious at the same time. But you're not selling the idea that this kind of procedure will replace with the existing institutions, right? It adds to, it transforms, and it will take a long time to see. In my view, this is a long-term process, because this is a sort of incremental, step-by-step, pervasive sort of cultural revolution, because it really has the ambition of transforming key assumptions and key pillars of the way democracy works. Um, you, you said you're not trying to snatch power from politicians, interest groups, and technocrats, but they might see it that way, right? And it's a challenge to persuade them that this is not a zero-sum game, that this can be a sort of positive sum game. But it's not easy. I mean, politicians, technocrats, interest groups are very self-centered, and they don't like to give up power. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, if the ordinary citizen, for one reason or another, does not notice that the adoption of the mini public procedure makes a difference, generates binding decisions that can, including run contrary to what was the prior pre-existing preferences of politicians, technocrats, and group interests. At the end of the day, they will come to the conclusion that this is just make-believe, right? That they're being cheated by very sophisticated and smart. I'm not saying that you're doing that, please, right? But this is a risk. So you have to strike a balance between, on the one hand, not scare technocrats, politicians, and group interests too much, right? In order to talk them in. On the other hand, if they're really in full agreement with you, you might alienate the ordinary citizen, right? And I will come to this later because let me make the question right now. Do you have any single example in which the decision, the conclusion arrived at by this work was completely opposite to because everyone has a starting point. No one comes to a discussion with a sort of a blank mind, right? This is one question that I think it's important. But as I said, I think you're doing something which is it's really interesting, and it runs contrary to the spirit of the time. It's an uphill battle because we live in an age where it's not the dynamic of public opinion has changed for the worse in terms of its vulnerability to manipulation, in terms of its inability to focus longer than 1 minute in each issue.
Let me jump in because it's going to make for a better video clip. If
go
statement
ahead,
you
go
just
ahead,
made,
interrupt me. Okay.
I am interrupting a bit, but
No.
work with me.
No, go ahead.
One spirit of the time is our short attention span, but I want to suggest there's a bigger spirit of the times, and that is the people with yellow vests on going through Paris, that the other protesters, they see insiders running the system, they see an aristocratic class, and they want to see a role for outsiders. They want to see a role for people who are not the professional politicians. A jury of citizens is a controlled way of including outsiders in a way that is pragmatic and operational. So if there's a great trend to outsiders, we say to politicians, do you want to do it in an uncontrolled way? Do you want to do it in a way that is actually complementary to the political system? So maybe one trend against attention, you're right, it does hurt us, but there is a bigger trend where people in elected office are saying, I think we need to do something.
Yeah, no, you don't need to, you're preaching to the converted in a way. I mean, the sense that...
Why did you bring some more of the unconverted?
The thing is, and my point would be, if it's done in a so controlled way that people realize or notice that it is meant to sort of mitigate their anger or to channel their anger in a more constructive way, that won't work in a large scale. Because I think, talking about the spirit of the time, I think there is this technological change, social media, blah, 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 right? But on the other hand, there is this sort of political ideological polarization that cuts across societies, not only in Brazil, but elsewhere, which has deep roots, not only in the structure of societies, then that we can talk about new forms of capitalism, blah, 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 and so on and so forth, but this revivalism was sort of, we thought the religious wars were behind us, right? Breaking news, they are in new forms, they're coming back. And they revolve around different issues, right? Moral issues, cultural issues, same-sex marriage, abortion. And so as much as I like this procedure, what I'm trying to do here is to shed light not only on, exclusively on procedural problems that you might face, but on the bigger picture, because this runs contrary to the spirit of the time. Technology and also big transformations in ideology and the structure of society, and I think this is might be a matter of a point of concern to move ahead with this kind of experiments that you do. The very final question, which is a sort of at the sort of micro level. One question. It's hard when you're trying to mediate the discussion between a group made up of different people with different mindsets, different backgrounds, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. How do you manage to be neutral and not to nudge the group in this or that direction? This is not easy, because I have preferences myself. It's to cancel them and to become like a robot-like kind of mediator. It's not easy. Second thing, how to avoid a temptation or of sort of cutting off the extremes and diluting opinions in order to reach a lesser common denominator, right? So you come to a conclusion. It's the opposite risk of reaching a conclusion which runs completely against the pre-existing preferences, which is you dilute, and you make and you build a consensus which is essentially void, right? Too diluted. So in a very unorganized way, these are the comments that I would like to make.
I think we can listen. Sorry, the second discussion and then.
Well, thank you very much also for the invitation. All the institutions that, in fact, are part of this meeting today, and also to Jan to come and bring to us some very new, innovative experiences and experience that might inspire us to think about our problems of the Brazilian democracy. I want to make just 2 or 3 very general questions, because the problem of speaking after someone so clever and intelligent as Sergio means that part of what he has said is also something that worries me. So in a sense, I felt represented by some of his questions. So I have 1 or 2 general questions. The first one, liberal democracy is under a very strong crisis all over the world. Part of the crisis is related to the operation of main structures of the liberal democracy, particularly political parties and parliaments, which means that in a sense, majority of people, not only mass demonstrations of protesters that happen in Brazil and some other countries, but also and this is related to public opinion surveys. Strong majorities don't feel represented, don't feel that political parties represent, and don't feel that the way decisions are taken, there's nothing to do with real common life of people. So I think this is a big challenge that is, in part, is related also to the reason why in recent elections in many countries, populist leaders have been elected, and in a sense, simplifying the message and disqualifying institutions, procedures, and also norms of the way the democracy needs to function in order to be a trustable kind of a political regime. So I think it's a general question related to which I feel, I would say it's very good that we have initiatives as the one you are working with in order to suggest, to propose, to initiate innovation. We need innovation. In a sense, there's one stronger demand for precisely innovation that, in a sense, take common people to take part of it. So this is my general question, and I would say, as Sergio mentioned, I like the approach. I like the approach, and I think that is quite interesting. It's implied the way people will take part on this project. My second question, however, is related to the scale. When we talk about liberal democracy crisis, we are talking about countries and areas and regions, and in a sense, a sort of generalized phenomenon that is related to reasons why politicians, political parties, and particularly parliament, have been working very badly, and in a sense, at least giving the impression for common people that is against them. So, if we think that this universal or generalized scale, the next question would be how one how one example that starts with common and small groups can give the example and in a sense means a possibility that to address to the general public to say, well, there's a possibility of changing democracy and making it work in a different way that will be respectful and meaningful for you. I mean, I don't see quite clear how to change from the small experience to this general. I mean, I'm emphasizing this for one reason. I am one of the persons that think that we are in risk with some democratic developments in some of our countries. Not only Brazil, not only Hungary, not only Poland, not only Turkey, not only Venezuela, but many. Also, you know, if we think some dimensions of the election of Donald Trump in the USA, in a sense, you know, these risks are included. So, in face of these risks, I would say, I want to learn more and to understand better in which sense the small experience could be, the innovative experience could be a difference. So this is one is my second question. My third question is related to some ways of doing the experience. I mean, for instance, in a certain reading reading the book, part of the book, I think that there's one important emphasis when you say about the recruitment of the groups. One particular advantages is related to the diversity of the origins and the way people will be working together, and this might help, might create conditions to produce trust in a wider community because they feel that they are represented there. But then the question that brings to my mind is, if you think about one specific group, this is okay. This is obviously a good result. But if you think that this, in a sense, is in contrast with the general feeling of rejection of politics, rejection of our politicians, rejection of political parties, how to actually make that the feeling of trust of this small, wide community may be representative for the others. Also, one other point is related to the fact that you say the experience doesn't look at recruiting people from the interest groups, because this would, in a sense, have a negative effect on the discussion, on the way people would take the problems. But if you don't take interest groups, how do you can have a guarantee that this also the ideological diversity and also the diversity related to different social issues will be represented in the experience? Well, and finally, one final point related to time. I like very much the idea that the small groups are taking one very complex problem and deep problem. It has to go deeply and understanding and study and discuss to create consensus in terms of what would be the best decision to be taken. But if you think in some of the needs of a country like Brazil, with the level of inequalities that we have, with the level of problems that are behind that we still didn't ever touch up to now, a long time might be a negative point, a negative result if you think about the urgency, the emergency of certain questions. So I know that this could be two different kind of stimulus. One is to have decisions taken in a sort of very deep process of cognitive process, knowledge, understanding, and at the same time creating consensus, which obviously is very important for democracy. Conditions in which people are able to understand others in political tolerance and create consensus in this condition. But as opposed to some other emergencies, it brings one doubt to my mind about the way the system would operate. And finally, one final question, Jan. I understood what you said about the relation with the politicians. But if we think that we have, in the case of Brazil, three very complex, different levels of public administration: local, the state, and the federal one. And in all these areas, you have politicians with different kind of dimensions and the ways they become, competent to actually produce decisions. How would you convince people in these different levels that solutions and eventually answers given in small groups might be generalized for them that are, in a sense, willing to be successful in their career as politicians?
It is a very comprehensive set of questions. I got 6 there and about 51 here. So I will blend your answers together because they're actually complementary. You've actually touched on issues, and please then we'll have general questions. I hope there are things that come up from you as well. So, just got to get this in the right order. You started with parties versus parliaments. I start from the point of view that all systems, people learn how to exploit them over time. Whether it's taxation laws, people work out how to do offshore companies. Bus tickets in Australia, people have worked out if you take certain patterns of journeys, you click into the free. People always learn over time how to beat a system. So it is with parties and democracies. There's a set of rules, and being in government is much more fun than not being in government. So they go right to the edge of the electoral rules. It's rational. With Cambridge Analytica, which was a great controversy, actually most of what they did was not illegal. This is the amazing thing. Now, and I will talk mainly to Australian politicians because it's what I'm more familiar with. I'm always hesitant when I only get a little bit of Brazil news from time to time. A politician running for office at home, they will turn up in a factory, put on the hard hat and the colourful jacket because they are there for the working man. And later that afternoon, they will be in a childcare centre holding a baby because they are for families. And later that day, they will be in a national park patting a koala because they care about the environment. You see, they're trying to give different messages to different audiences because voters care about different things. What did Cambridge Analytica let them do? On Facebook, you can target an ad to a specific person, someone who eats Snickers, wears Adidas, likes Atletico Madrid. You can get very specific. And now instead of being in 3 places in a day, they can be in 1 million places at once. When the politician had to appear in person, we could see what they were doing. Well, you said one thing to one person, another thing to another person. That's what we look at and say, all systems get gamed. That's the actual core of this challenge. And that's the reason. When I look at, you mentioned things around demonstrators. Demonstration used to be super effective. It would scare people in elected office to go, oh, look at all those people who are against me. But over time, they learnt to use those demonstrations as something to empower them. Look at that rabble in the street. Look at these unthinking people. And we started to form the view of what's wrong with demonstration. You can suggest that it is an unrepresentative group. There's no statistical claim you could make about demonstrators. They are just chanting slogans. What do they know? You see how easy it is. Over time, you learn how to make an argument. When we have protests in Australia, it is the opposite side of Parliament who tends to benefit. It's our last election came about, a lot of people on both sides of politics put it down to a protest against a coal mine, very much helped the other side of politics. It's counterintuitive. And that's why, the reason I come to this is, if protests are not working and a government can say these are unrepresentative groups of people chanting slogans, say fantastic. Doesn't that mean you're in favour of representative groups of people taking the time to learn? And that's how we start to find the path to innovation. Now, you asked a fabulous question about how you scale this up to country level, and you asked me a trust question about if it's too controlled, have you had a project go really badly against the government's interests? And I'm going to answer your questions together. We got a call from the Premier of South Australia, which is an economy that it's had steel mills close, it's had car industries leave the country, so they needed something new. And we always say to politicians, tell us what's hard. Tell us what that hard decision is where public opinion and public judgment will be different. And they said, well, we'd like to explore whether to build a facility to take the entire world's high-level nuclear waste. Politically difficult, 11 out of 10. We ran a project in 3 parts, and for the sake of brevity, it's all on our website. You can just look at Nuclear Fuel Cycle Project. We got one group of citizens to simply read a Royal Commission report and write the government's collateral. It worked fantastically. We could take a group of people from all walks of life, engage them in something technical and complex. They could express themselves in plain English, and because we get them to write every word in the reports together, they all stood up and said, look, this is ours. We can show you news footage of the Premier arriving through mounted police and protesters, but citizens inside feeling the confidence to talk to TV cameras saying, no, they didn't cheat. They just let us read this report, asked us what experts we wanted to hear from, gave us a bunch of time and we wrote it ourselves. Citizens themselves are the great shock absorber. You cannot get 50 people to stand in front of something they don't believe in. You can get junior politicians to stand in front of something they don't believe in. You can get other people who are trying to curry favour to stand in front of something they don't believe in. but it's its own safety mechanism. The use of randomly selected people makes it uncheatable. Now, what happened at the end of that project, there was a final large-scale jury of 350 people, and it went tremendously badly. Now, I don't mean it generated the wrong answer. There is no right and wrong answer as to whether a state builds a nuclear waste facility. There is simply a decision where the bulk of citizens say, yeah, that works for us. Build it, don't build it, we don't care. But there was a perception that the government very much wanted to go ahead because it would yield an incredible amount of money. Other countries would pay you a lot of money to house the waste. So it was very difficult for us. What we got wrong on the scale question, juries work fantastically, 30 to 50 people. The brief from the government had said, no one will trust that citizens are at the centre of this decision. Design us something so big that it dominates the news. So we took 350 people. Now, 350 people at round tables in a conference room is immense. And it was story one on the news. And if anyone wants to hang around, we can show you some news clips so you get a feel for it. It was designed to be run in 10 groups of 35, because 35 is a really good learning environment. It's not what happened. In any group, you mentioned also about people with, I think you mentioned, don't wash out people with extreme views. We don't filter the jurors. We get who we get. In any group of 35 to 50, one or two people are considerable outliers. In a group of 350, they all find each other quickly. And they started to behave more like protesters than citizens. They found a box of red dots and stuck it on their name badges to say, I will never ever consider another point of view. It's not deliberation, but they were determined, they got reinforced social behaviour. So, to answer your question, yeah, we have dramatic decisions where it very much was not in the government's interest. And because the decision was made poorly, it was a little painful. But it's turned into a recognition on both sides of politics that we don't launder decisions, that citizens will say what they want to say. To your question about scale, anytime we know we want to do something at large scale, Australia is 25 million people, but a big place, like geographically the size of Europe. We look at, what do I need to do to have people like me? We would probably run that in 14 locations for the first 4 or 5 days, while people explore evidence and start to find common ground. That could be 100 locations in Brazil. The point is to keep the groups at 35 to 50 people for 4 to 5 days, because they'll form social norms about respect and learning and listening to one another. We keep that group size, and then it's like a pyramid. We can take either the whole group or subsets of the group and progressively get them to come together and say, we learned A, B, and C. What did you learn? Oh, we learned something completely different. And that's how we build up a large-scale process. But to be completely clear, we got it wrong the first time we did it. We ran a project where the first half of it was fantastic, and fantastic in the sense that they clearly expressed themselves, they gave a reason, and they felt confident that they owned it, would stand in front of a TV camera. The second process, because of scale and dynamics, generated an unintelligible result, but we learned from it, and that's why we start to have more confidence to build. And that really, for me, is a critical learning. We know how to scale, but we learnt through failure. A couple of other gems were, you mentioned diversity of thinking and a contrast to Parliament. I'll speak mainly to Australia because I'm a guest in your country. If I look at the Australian Parliament, the average representative has 3 houses and a net worth of a couple of $1 million. It's not what the population looks like. We need to see people like us in decisions. It's fair enough that they've got that wealth, and I don't seek to take anything away, but isn't it great to see people in everyday jobs also involved in the decision? And it is that also point. The diversity of thinking is central. There's a book called The Difference by Scott Page. In it, there's a tendency, there are 2 criticisms we get a lot. One of them is, I think we should just leave this to the experts. Experts also have limitations in their thinking. The thing that Scott Page tested out, He was initially a PhD student. Someone knows the book. This is great because you can test me. He gave a number of examples, but the central one was he took 4 oil pipeline engineers, and then he took 4 people with roughly equivalent education, but no expertise in the field. And he gave them a problem. I want you to move oil from this country to this market. How did an oil pipeline engineer solve that? With a pipeline. You're a pipeline engineer. You solve everything with a pipeline. And they might be right. How did the non-expert group solve it? They asked for help. Well, we should hear from an oil pipeline engineer. We should hear from someone in shipping. Maybe shipping is a better way to do it. Actually, why don't we hear from a manufacturer who transforms the oil at source into whatever it's going to get made into? They were informed by expertise without being constrained by expertise. And we use this phrase, we want expertise on tap, but not on top. The interesting punchline in Scott's book is the results were shown to the Shell Oil Investment Board. You can probably picture this is not a group full of cuddly hippies trying to be about people power. They consistently took the non-expert group's recommendation. It's a really interesting validation of, I'm not saying exclude expertise from decisions, and it is the diversity of thinking in the group that actually does add something. In Australian parliaments, the bulk of our politicians are solicitors and former union officials. Most people will come through having been a political advisor, student politician, political advisor, earn a seat. It's quite a narrowing. So that is a problem we try to solve. You also mentioned about interest groups. I'm not saying exclude special interests, but to use the courtroom analogy, you're an expert witness, you're not a juror. I'd love to have them in presenting evidence, but if you have a very firm and passionate point of view, and in our experience, probably find it a little bit hard to change your mind, wouldn't you love the opportunity to present to 50 citizens I've picked at random? Ultimately, everybody believes they're right. That's why when I pitch this process, whether people are from environmental and renewable energy groups or a fossil fuel industry, we say, would you like the chance to present to this group? Of course, everyone thinks they'll agree with them. I want to come back to your 2 controlled exercise. And this works well in rooms where everyone has a smartphone. In a very early project, if you Google the name Daniel Gannon Citizens Jury, someone's going to have a phone and play with it. The very first project I did for a state premier, we sent out 20,000 invitations. About 2,200 people said, yes, I will give you the 6 days needed. And from that 2,200, we picked 43 people. So you can see there's 2 rounds of randomisation in that. And one of those 43 people was the head of communications for the opposition leader. You can be unlucky. And it stood. Random is random. And it's the smartest thing we ever did, because now when people are sceptical and say, oh, you must exclude people you don't like, I say, just Google this name and I can't cheat this. If I was going to cheat, wouldn't I have filtered him out? A first project for a state premier, I would have pulled it out, but it stood. And now here we are. Do you think I'm going to cheat? So the mix of happy accidents, and it comes from taking a light touch. Don't try to think, what are the 42 types of special interest I need to exclude? Trust the random mix. And this is a really big part of the random draw, is you won't get 30 lawyers. You won't get 30 teachers. You'll get a rough mix of the population. There's also a lot of elements to people's identity. You can sometimes think, we often get people with a disability because it's a very accessible format, because there's a lot of written materials where for the blind they can get a reader to play into their ears. It's small group discussion, so it's much more accessible than a town hall meeting where people are shouting. Other people who have a disability that affects their life, even if it's quite different, will see someone else even though it's a different disability. But that lady who's blind can also be a writer. She can also be an Uber driver, or not an Uber driver. She can also be an artist. Sorry, I was just top of mind. There'll be many elements to someone's identity. So it's not one rigid thing. It's she's a lady of an age group or with interests or a tennis player or whatever it may be. People have many aspects where, someone like me is in the decision. You spoke about being neutral. I have learnt with this job, you run this many projects, you start to realise that there's a lot of answers. I probably came more from the big stick school of government, that there's one right answer and I'm going to beat it into you. In a lovely way, you know, we all think we're right about things. If you stop, firstly, my main self-interest is that the group champions something. So we can destroy our whole organisation and 10 years of what we've been doing by trying to nudge something in one direction or another. But the other part I'd encourage you to think about is, especially as people look at an American political context or very polarising issues around climate change, there's a tendency to think in terms of good guys and bad guys. My experience is that everybody's cheating the same amount. That there's enough trying to nudge systems in. People often look at right-wing populism. There's plenty of left-wing populism too. One might suggest Jeremy Corbyn is as much a populist as Boris Johnson, and that's the nature of elections. It's the whole aim is to get a lot of votes. I'm not sure when populists became such a negative term. It tends to be when it's someone I don't like. Most people in elected office are populists at some level. So hopefully I've covered when they run contrary. It does actually help you over time that enough people look at you, and even if they disagree, say, well, I'll give you one thing, you don't cheat. The thing that really does reinforce that, and I know I've said it, is citizens simply will not stand in front of a decision they don't believe in. If we tried to cheat it, and if someone else tried to influence them, they just won't wear it. It's a fabulous defence. The last question I want to address was related to both time and how to cover the levels of government. In terms of time, there are many urgent issues. In Australia, an urgent issue would be probably people on both sides of politics thinking that the level of welfare is unfair. It's too low, it's very hard to live on. And yes, we take time. We would need 6 to 9 months to ask a group of citizens, what's a fair level of welfare and how do you want to pay for it? But often these issues have been kicked down the road for 10 years, for 15 years, for 20 years. So while we take a lot of time, a climate change and energy topic. Yes, we need probably a year to do something on that topic. But I think you'll find our existing structures have taken a lot longer than a year thus far. So what's the harm in allowing the time and seeing what an informed group of citizens think? It was interesting in the Yellow Vest protests. You know, the main cause that got them protesting was fuel taxes. People are familiar. Fuel taxes. And the thing that really annoyed people, it was that the tax on fuel for our cars went up, but the fuel on private jets did not. Like, can you imagine what a great issue to get people really annoyed? Think about your opinion reaction to that. Just seems unfair, doesn't it? There's a global treaty that says jet fuel can never be taxed. It means that when a Qantas airliner comes to Brazil, you can't go, aha, and charge 100% fuel tax. It's just a shared treaty that you can't tax jet fuel. You start to see how your opinion view was a passionate reaction, but your judgment view starts to become, oh, I understand now why you can't do it. And you can't have people in elected office trying to explain that. You probably need someone who is a career driver, is a cafe worker, to be the one sharing what they've learned. The last point I'll make, and I'm sorry for being so long, but there were a lot of questions. How to convince the levels of government. We have a passionate funder who would love me to change the national government. Very passionate. But we started at council level. We started with local government because you need success. You need to prove that you are a safe pair of hands. You need to prove that you are neutral. You need to prove that you can actually get a representative group of people in the room, because it looks good on paper, but the real test is having other people in elected office go, no, they really did put a mix of people in there. And that first local project will give way to a second local project and then a state level project. And you build trust with each success. Yes, years ago, people in our federal government wouldn't dream of talking to us. That's changed. It's changed because of 28 projects that you run. I can't promise you a national project would work tomorrow, but if you start local, then yeah, across 5 or 8 years, people in elected office look for what's popular. They look for what gets good press. They look for what citizens like. They're no mugs. They'll grip hold of it as well. Hopefully I've answered 90% of your questions in that, and we'll open up to the group.
Well, thank you so much, Ian and Sergio and Moises, for the great debate you already made. And I'll open to the audience. But first, I'd like just to share, I was talking to Sylvia, we had 2 experiences in Brazil of mini publics already made for Delibera Brasil, one in Ilhéus, and another one here in São Paulo, in a perfect neighborhood. The first one was to design a local legislation to regulate a kind of taxi, a motor taxi. We have a motorcycle taxi. And the second one was to revitalize a street, the main street of the city, of this neighborhood, of this peripheral neighborhood here in São Paulo. And we already presented a paper last week in a congress reflecting on some issues on our experiences. And we made 2 questions, because we noticed that the politics, the core of the politics was absent of our debates, in our deliberations. People do not talk about partisans. They did not talk about civil society once they are organized, or nothing like that. It was apolitical, if I can use this word. So and Sylvia and I have a point we like to discuss, and with all the people from Delibera, because as a political scientist, I'm asking myself all the time, where is the politics? And what the cost for the democratic institutions to keep politics away from these discussions, in the sense. And the second questions we are discussing in Delibera, in our group, and we presented in this paper, is what's the impact on the political culture when we proceed mini publics and citizens' juries? Because, again, if politics is absent, how do we form a political culture, a more trusty political culture of trust in democratic institutions, or generalized trust between citizens and so on? So I'm just opening the debate. Just let's hold these questions, and we will listen to the audience if someone has a question. André.
Hello there.
And where you come from, please?
Yes. Hello there. I'm André. I'm from Sebrap. I'm a colleague of Zé and Sylvia, and we're working together. Thank you for your presentation. It's very, very compelling. I'll be brief. Okay. We now face a condition of illiberal democracies, which means that we can have an overall structure which behaves in a democratic way. Nevertheless, people's inner behavior and micro, I don't know, it doesn't work in the micro level. So it seems that mini publics brings democratic debate and sheds light into a place within the public policy cycle that used not to have this kind of conversation. So when you're going to frame or organize an idea, you bring the public within. So this is new. Nevertheless, isn't this a specific tool? Should we, maybe we should develop further tools to other, cases and conditions within the public ciclo de políticas públicas. So that's it. Fair enough.
Share this round. Oh.
One or two more, and then you can answer. Okay. Great. We have 30 minutes more, so.
I'm not sure. I've seen in some of the examples in the Democracy and R&D network that it's quite important to have the commitment that whatever deliberation is going to be taken by the mini public will be made into some kind of consequence. I guess that's the same in the Australian projects, because this is the invitation they receive has already this kind of commitment. What if the mini public cannot guarantee, especially now for new experiences where we don't really know, we still have to prove, we cannot guarantee if they're going to be taken into account in terms of their decision? How negative could that be for the experience if we cannot guarantee this kind of continuity of the decision?
Anyone? Sylvia? Okay.
I think I just want to contribute on the question of Professor Moises about the scale. There is an experience in the United States, the Health Democracies organization that holds this citizen juries. They hold this before the referendums on state decisions, on legislative decisions. So they hold the mini publics and they get these results, the recommendations, the recommendations of the mini public, the citizen jury, and they print and then give to the voters together with the ballot. So the voters know what people like them learned and taught and recommend as decision. And many surveys have shown that citizens in Oregon, they have been doing that for 15 years, 10 years, I guess. Yes, 8 years, to 2011. So citizens are recognizing this source as a trustful mediator for political information and for helping their hard decisions. So I guess that this scale for larger public, for the general public, we believe at Delibera Brazil that this dissemination of the process and the reasoning, as Ian was telling, the reasoning behind the recommendations, all this reverberation on this is a very important element of this. So in the deliberative system of our democracy.
We'll share this round. There's 3 great questions there. In terms of further tools, I always like to think, what are in terms of the challenges to our democracy? There's agenda setting. Are our parliaments talking about what we care about? And there's decision making. You can use lots and lots of, the jury mechanism, I don't see it as an agenda setting tool. It's really when there is a vexed, very politically difficult decision is the best time to say, right, we want a set of recommendations. Now, we're not digital advocates. We look at a lot of technology and struggle to see an example of saying, the internet, that's a great place where people go to listen to one another, hear different views, consider evidence and change their minds. Find me an example of that and we'll keep going. But it could be great at saying, agenda setting is really opinion. I want my government to talk about drug policy. I want my government to talk about why I can't afford a house. That kind of thing doesn't require a lot of thinking. It's what is on the mind of citizens. So there's an entirely different tool. There are transparency tools. That's where we like to the suite of tools, but I do encourage people to think about, start from, is this agenda setting and hearing the population so our parliaments respond? Or is it that, no, we know we need to talk about it, but we don't know how to get to an answer? There's surveys in Australia which say people want action on climate change, like 92%. How many people are willing to pay $10 more per month for it? 7%. See why it's politically difficult? Because if the government acts on the 92%, their bills will go up and people will be unhappy. The commitment. We've done projects at our outset, generously funded a national project just to see if this concept was going to work at all. It was called the Australian Citizens Parliament. So it was run without the formal link to an elected decision maker. Had a lot of positives. It proved that you could recruit a very representative mix of people. Proved that they could work together. Proved that they could read and think. But there was no pre-agreed commitment. So politicians went, that's nice, that's tremendous. And I would strongly suggest you don't run projects without that political commitment, because they're not going to adopt it after if they don't buy in up front. Your healthy democracy comment is fabulous. What Healthy Democracy Oregon or Healthy Democracy have achieved, absolutely you have to respect. They took this really difficult scenario, they injected citizens in a very neutral, trusted way, and they solved a problem for legislators. I think it's a really simple lesson to take away about solve the problem that legislators cared about. And I distill it very simply as this. Up and down the west coast of the US, you have citizens-initiated referenda. Sounds fantastic, but you can get anything passed with enough advertising. Do you think hospitals are important? Yeah. Okay, do you want to mandate that 20% of your taxes go into it? Absolutely. There's no thinking, you're just reacting. And then the police are quite smart and they go, law enforcement's important. Don't you think that 20% of the... Absolutely, everyone's clicking yes. Pretty soon they spent more money than they had. What did they need? They needed a mechanism that would get citizens to think and say, on some of these ballot measures, they look really attractive, but now that we've thought and heard from evidence, it's actually not that attractive. With it came the ability to scale a message out, because the commitment is not always to act on it. The commitment can be to publicise and to respond. I think that's what I wanted to link the two, is get the commitment that you can, but just get some commitment. So the good news here is, hopefully I'm using examples where, look at Ireland, look at Healthy Democracy, look at what the team are achieving in Belgium from the G1000 group. I used to think we were pretty good, but we're getting overtaken by all these people, and it's a good problem to have. You know, why did we come to Brazil? Partly the local team. We're hoping, we have a lot of confidence that Delibera are going to be the ones to say, now look at this icon project, and we'll fall another notch in the rankings. That's a really good problem to have.
Just to piggyback on what you've just said, I think it's important, in spite of the fact that you're right, that referenda at the local level, at the state level in the US can be manipulated in all sorts of ways. I think it's important to build on the traditions of each country. The United States has a long tradition of town hall meetings, of local referenda, and it's interesting if you can add this mechanism to this long-time tradition. I think you can add value to it. You need some place where to anchor your initiative, and I think this is important to have in mind when we think about Brazil, on where in local governments, in a way or another, have, to some extent, here and there, some tradition of constrained, limited, etc., etc., etc. But it's a nice starting point, I guess. And whether politics gets in the way, or it is, the thing is, politics is always there. Even think about Australia. I think it's not a coincidence that this experiment has roots in Australia. Australia, for the last, it's an unique case of a country who has been growing for the last 28 years consecutively without a year in which GDP has dropped, either Conservative Party in government or the Labour Party in government. So in as much as polarization is a problem everywhere, and also in Australia, the level of polarization in Australia is much, much lower than in many, many other countries. The Australian government has distinguished itself for creating institutions that can think forward, think long term, think about the competitive commission, so long term plan. So this is politics. It's a polity, right, where consensus has been a central element in the decision making process. Let me finish by referring to it's a lousy joke. British, typically arrogant and prejudiced against Australia, and you might remember that. What's the difference between Australia and culture? Australia and yogurt. Yogurt, you put it under the sun and it develops a culture after some time. The thing is, the United Kingdom is going down the drain nowadays. It's incredible. And Australia is doing great. And I think this, so just to refer to this question of where politics, because if you don't have the kind of sort of basic political infrastructure that is somewhat conducive to consensus building, it's hard to scale up or to go ahead with many. The point is, when you reach a certain point of distrust in public officials and distrust among people, you might need some other leverages, because
So this is very, very, very important. I mean, Sergio, during lunchtime was mentioned, I mean, all the levels of trust among people in this country is very low, which means that sometimes people gather, but they don't trust with whom they are gathering in order to produce. I mean, it's one more problem, one more obstacle, but not necessarily it means that the experience couldn't work. I mean, I think it has to be taken into consideration.
Can I just jump back to a point that you made? I remember my early projects, politicians would say, now how are you going to balance the political ideological mix? You know, I've got to make sure this is 50% people of the right and 50% people of the left. For Australia, we have 16.5 million voters. How many people are in political parties? In total, about 40,000. So 0.2 of 1%. Do you know my odds of hitting someone who is quite political? It's really low. That's the really interesting part, is most people don't have passionate views, which means they're going to yell at the person next to them. You're local, I'm a guest. It's for you to judge. But if I pick any 100 Brazilians, how many of them are going to be capable of having a pretty easygoing conversation? They might have different views, but they can discuss them. And one of the things is, you may think, oh, what do I look at newspapers online? That's online. Put people in a room. Sit across a table. Let them know they're going to be spending a few days together. Behaviour changes. There is something about in-person that matters. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't lost when you made the comment about being apolitical. If I could make just one tiny point on the ACCC. People who oppose what we do say elections and voting are the only fair way to do things. Now the ACCC, it's the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, so it protects consumer rights and makes sure large companies don't do anti-competitive things. It's actually an example of an organisation which is made independent of those in elections. We, like many countries, have a reserve bank. Reserve bank sets interest rates, and it's distinctly kept separate from those in elected office, because those in elected office say, oh, an election's coming, let's make the interest rates go down. And up it goes. You don't want someone whose judgment is affected by popularity to be making a technical decision. So I think what we have is, yes, we live in, I don't want to be Chicken Little, we live in a pretty happy place. But we have our challenges, and often we've innovated by moving some powers away and diluting away from those in elected office. And the lesson is a good one. Why have an independent reserve bank? Why have an ACCC? It's because those in elected office actually saw a benefit from sharing their power. I just think there's a conversation to be had about sharing power again. And we can discuss the UK and culture another time.
Well, thank you. I
I
think
have to excuse myself, but I have to leave. Okay.
thank you so
It's-
much, Serge,
it's
for your
been wonderful.
contribution.
Thank you. We keep in touch. Bye bye.
Thank you, Serge. Well, I think we can make another round if the audience have any other question. Who has the microphone? And
I wanted to go back to the question of trust and where we are in Brazil. I've been working with.
sorry, could you please just introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Daniela. I work as a facilitator at Rios Partners, who work with multi-sectors groups for different areas and fields. And one project that we had was in the sector of education a few years ago. So it's very interesting because it was the timing also is very important, because it was right after a national plan has passed, and people has already some consensus there. So we could pull up a very diverse group of people to think about the future. They could not come together. They didn't want to come together to act. So we had to spend some time thinking. So thinking about doing some exercise that we do as a scenarios planning. And it's interesting because sometimes time had passed after this exercise, and recently part of the group has said we had to come back together and ask us to do that exercise. They said, wow, interesting. Let's see. So we went listening to some of the people who were in the group, and no, they don't want to go. It's so polarized that a lot of people said, no, I don't want to sit with that person again. So I think we are in some areas, political, especially if you're talking about broad problems. I know there's a difference between a local specific problem, and I see where you're bringing, because I was also a community organizer in the United States, and I see this has a lot of potential. But when we talk about like a more federal and broad problems that are common also to many of us in Brazil, it's very hard to sit to act together. So I was just, I've been thinking how to move that into an agenda that people really, to frame the problem, that people would also go over where we are and really will be open to act together.
I'd like to give a little testimony from our Brazilian experiences, because I think this polarization reality here is really a concern. And that's what José Verissimo was saying, that we take some extra cares, I think more than New Democracy does here, regarding to this hardcore politics involved in the subject. And it's simple things, like for Ilhéus, we are talking about motor taxis. We create a reference group with the stakeholders, so the mototaxistas were not in the mini public. We filtered that. They were in the reference group giving their message to the mini public. The same thing, if we are going to do something on climate change, we won't get environmentalists and those that are passionate on that. They are going to be in the reference group, and they will have to choose, dialoguing to the others, which information we should give to the citizens who are not passionate on that, but who are the ones who will be affected finally about the decision. So this is a way that we filter. So we have some cares with filters, and we put this hardcore politics in a reference group. And this is tricky, but we are learning also. This is a learning process. So.
And I think Sylvia's covered it, but there's just critical differences in how self-selected and randomly selected groups work. People who are active in their community, and it's great to believe in something, and I don't seek to exclude their voices, but I seek to rebalance it, but they are the people who find it hardest to discuss with others who hold different views. So we often run parallel groups with purely randomly selected groups and then curated active groups. And this second, they just don't work. They cannot find agreement. And that's where the greatest realisation for people in elected office is if I'm a packaged water advocate or opponent, it doesn't matter. And I go and meet with the Minister for Waste, and I ask for 7 things, and the Minister agrees to do 6 of them. The advocate is unhappy. The advocate will go out and sensibly make noise about the one thing that won't happen. If I'm a randomly selected citizen, I've given 6 Saturdays of my time and I've told the Minister 7 things. And he says, yeah, you've done well, I'll do 6 of them. They go home going, that's fantastic, you did 6 of them. That's the difference in motivation. And I just encourage you to look at group composition. Hear from both types of people, but you get just completely different results.
Anyone else?
I'd like you to talk a little bit about short-term expectations and medium and long-term expectations, because when the levels of trust are very low, we have to commit to short-term expectations and build from this up. And how would you say that these juries could help to build trust in a larger way and cope these short-term expectations to long-term ones?
It's very hard to forecast how democratic systems change because we have no precedent really for how democratic systems change. So there's a lot of unknown unknowns. So all I can offer you is a view. The example I like to give is in our very first project. It was a place called the City of Canada Bay. It's effectively a suburb of inner Sydney. About 75,000 people, relatively well off, but kind of middle, doing quite well. But, you know, people have still got bills to pay, not rich. In that jury, it was followed by a local tabloid newspaper. Not local, a citywide thing called the Daily Telegraph, owned by Rupert Murdoch, you know, which some people would have an issue with. But at the core of this story is that a newspaper decided, a newspaper, whatever its outlook and ideology, generally has one thing in common. You, my reader, would do a better job than these fools we have in government. What is a jury? It is made up of the newspaper's readers. So very quickly they decided, hang on, we like these people. So they ran pictures of the jury. They ran a headline that said, Hero Mayor gives power to the people. That's how an idea spreads. Because what happens is other people in elected office go, how did you get in the major tabloid, get a photo op? This was a left-aligned mayor in what is considered a right-aligned newspaper. But the newspaper liked it because it wasn't about the mayor. It was about people who were their readers. I think that's the path to change. When you do a project, it's great for the 40 or 50 people involved, but have a positive relationship with the media. And don't play favourites. It's not about left-wing media liking it or right-wing media liking it. They all have readers and they all think their readers are going to be pulled in that jury because they are, because there'll be a mix. So the short-term versus long-term blends in. Your short-term project makes a long-term impact because people are starting to see The juries now are part of how we make decisions. We've only been doing this for 8 to 10 years. I know it sounds like a long time, but it's gone very fast. And now when they do democratic surveys of, what could make Australian democracy better, there's always things around donations and lobbyists. But in the top 5 now is increased use of juries. That's incomprehensible to us from 8 years ago when people would just laugh at us. So I think your question comes from, how do we start from this point where it looks too hard? Well, the answer is just start. It's why we are investing in Brazil with the Undeaf Fund. It's why we're investing that the Libera may have success, may, learn a little bit from what we've done in the past, and then we'll go to the next city, and then maybe to the next state legislature and be able to roll out those projects. The gap between the short and the long term is by doing something. I don't mean to give a trite answer, but I can't give a better one.
Is that all? Okay, so thank you so much, Ian, Moises, for the debate. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. And he's traveling from Brussels, Australia, Brussels, Fortaleza, São Paulo, and so on.
We see it here.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the audience. And let's deliberate then, right? Thank you.